Yeah, there's been a few times where my phone's broken and I just feel like I can't do it. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight to the Saul Sidore lecture series. This lecture series was established by donation from Saul Sidore, prominent New Hampshire businessman in the last century. Sidore was a driving force in support of the ideals of humanity and brotherhood throughout New Hampshire in his time living and working in the state. And his family have continued in that tradition with generous efforts such as this lecture series. The Sidore lecture series is a venue to bring new perspectives to contemporary issues in society, which is exactly what we've been doing here in the current series, Reframing the Opioid Crisis. The language of how we deal with social problems we are facing, on the one hand does, and on the other hand does not, have a very real impact on people. What am I talking about? What does that mean? On the one hand, people addicted to drugs and people in recovery regularly experience stigma. Thus, how we talk about the issue is, for them, a concern. Yet on the other hand, is policing language really going to prevent a fentanyl overdose? It's this wicked problem that Darin Weinberg's talk is addressed to. Coming to us from a field of sociology very concerned with both language and how we act in the world, his research has run the gamut from constructions of homelessness, alcoholism, mental illness, in both historical and contemporary perspectives. His books include Intoxication in Society, Problematic Pleasures of Drugs and Alcohol, and Of Others Inside, Insanity, Addiction and Belonging in America. It is this attention to language both within social structure and the language itself as the social structure that undergirds these analyses. Tonight then, Dr. Weinberg turns his attention to language towards an ecological model of addiction. Thank you.
Right, well, thank you, Ed, for that introduction. Thank all of you for coming. I'd also like to thank the Sidore Lecture Series Planning Committee for inviting me to come along, and also the Sidore family for making these events possible. In my talk today, I'd like to honor in particular the mandate set by this series to bring a critical and perhaps controversial perspective to bear on the topic under consideration. That is the opioid crisis, both in New Hampshire and beyond. I will not be looking at the tragic and staggering number of overdose deaths we've witnessed in recent years, though I certainly do hope my remarks will suggest some lines of inquiry relevant to this crisis. Instead, I'll be more directly focused on an underlying set of clinical and scientific problems faced by those of us interested in developing and promoting effective remedies for drug addiction. I'm interested in exploring how the findings of science, and the social sciences more particularly, can be brought to bear not only to facilitate preventative and therapeutic interventions, but also how scientific findings have been historically and might now be more effectively brought to bear politically and culturally in providing persuasive warrant for such interventions in the first place. As I'm sure many of you know, at least since Benjamin Rush argued that habitual drunkenness is a physical and mental disease as much as it is a moral failing, the medical sciences of addiction have been as concerned with providing arguments to support a compassionate and restorative orientation to those who suffer from addictions as they have been with the production of good science as such. As the failed war on drugs of the last several decades amply demonstrates, incarceration and other punitive penalties for drug use have done much more harm than they've done good. They have significantly increased rather than decreased the severity of the consequences that drug use and addiction has in society generally, but even more acutely, they have increased the severity of the consequences of drug use and addiction for those who use or are addicted themselves. Defenders of what the historian David Courtwright has dubbed the NIDA brain disease paradigm have consistently emphasized the importance of defending a medical frame for drug problems in place of a criminal justice frame, not only because they believe the best neurological research suggests the scientific truth of this frame, but because they believe it is politically and culturally indispensable that we define addiction as a disease if it is to be met with an enlightened societal response that is, with sympathy rather than scorn. Today I want to take a closer look at this claim, as well as the claims of those who oppose it. I want to assess the extent to which received science has or has not provided a compelling scientific warrant for clinical care over criminal prosecution. As you'll see, I'm skeptical of both the disease camp's arguments and the arguments of those who oppose the disease paradigm and seek to provide a path forward in what I'm calling an ecological understanding of addiction. I will be arguing that while it is already widely accepted that social contextual factors play an enormously influential role in governing both the initiation and entrenchment of problematic patterns of drug use, the mechanisms through which contexts are said to cause addictive behavior are invariably cast as diverse types of incentives or disincentives that induce addicts to behave as they do. As a consequence, addictive behavior gets theoretically construed as the product of a contextually informed cost-benefit analysis, or to use the term often found in the literature, incentive-sensitive. For many experts, this provides strong evidence for the intrinsic, if notorious, rationality of problematic drug and alcohol use, and its voluntary rather than involuntary nature. However, for those of us invested in promoting therapeutic rather than punitive societal responses to addiction, it presents a rather serious crisis of legitimacy. For if addictive behavior is indeed rational and voluntary, then on what grounds shall we argue that addicts are in need of, and indeed deserving of, compassionate and therapeutic interventions as opposed to mere punishment? In this talk, I consider one particularly robust way the influence of context on addictive behavior can be explained without thereby eviscerating the warrant for therapeutic care. So to begin with a bit of history. During the 18th century, one increasingly observed Christian and civic Republican jerrymaids complaining that the luxury and self-indulgence of the prosperous were infecting the rest of society to an extent that threatened the nation's survival. The spread of profligacy had been a common refrain among Christians since the restoration of Charles II in 1660, but it was widely held to have been exacerbated by the growth in trade and the material prosperity that came with it in the early modern era. Wealth, it was said, was distracting the English people from virtue, and thereby from both true freedom and also good health. Christian reformers and others joined forces in the 18th century in opposition to both the lusty indulgences of the crown and court and those of the increasingly ubiquitous men of commerce. It was they who were to blame for enticing the morally and intellectually vulnerable working classes into extravagant and unnatural habits that, while immoral among the better sort, were positively ruinous for the poor, particularly poor women and children. This trend was not only enervating and enslaving individuals, but the nation as a whole, by making the quote-unquote useful ranks of the population morally, intellectually, and physically unfit. Few of the corrupting effects of luxury received more attention than the abuse of distilled spirits. This was particularly so following the so-called gin craze that swept England in the early 18th century. By the time that Benjamin Rush and Thomas Trotter, who are widely regarded as the fathers of addiction medicine, lent their authority to the notion that habitual drunkenness is a genuine disease, we're now talking about the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the general contours of their arguments had become all but commonplace among Christian intellectuals and civic Republican patriots. These arguments were dedicated to stemming the rot of royal and aristocratic indulgence and caprice, the amoral and licentious pursuit of profit through trade, and the growing depravity and disorder that they observed in the increasingly overflowing and overwhelmed urban centers. Translating Christian and Republican concerns for the vicious temptations of luxury and licentiousness into the quasi-medical language of nervous overstimulation, natural and unnatural passions, the arguments of Rush and Trotter reiterated broader anxieties regarding the political, the social, moral and medical dangers of overindulgence, and in particular, the growing temptations in this regard introduced by growing wealth, modern civilization, and urban life. And like their Christian and Republican compatriots, Rush and Trotter located the cure for addiction in the embrace of temperance, convivial personal relationships, modest living, and the refuge to be found in the agrarian countryside. Recovery from addiction, then, both could and should be fostered through the moderation of nervous stimulation and the suppression of desires to satiate the unnatural passions provoked and unleashed by the dazzle of urban life. In sum, public concern with addiction began in earnest in the early modern era, when many expressed fears concerning the cataclysmic social changes they perceived taking place around them, and the effects of these social changes on people's physical and mental health. In these early days, and well into the 19th, if not the early 20th century, theories of addiction, like, for example, Charles Miller Beard's influential theory of neurasthenia, literally nervous exhaustion, highlighted the conditioning effects that modern and particularly urban environments had on our minds, bodies, and behavior, and the therapeutic value of literal asylum from these pathogenic environments. These kinds of arguments were also well rehearsed among early social scientists. Both Marx and Durkheim also indicted the growth of capitalism as behind the increasing tendencies of people to become enslaved by their appetites. It was industrial capitalism, they argued, that unmoored people from an orientation to consumption bound to the satisfaction of needs to one of limitless, self-destructive insatiability. In his economic and philosophical manuscripts, for example, Marx wrote of capitalism, "Excess and intemperance come to be its true norm." Because capitalism thrives best when people continue to consume and to spend well beyond what they need, it systematically intensifies our appetites beyond our capacities to ever really fulfill them, and perhaps in more extreme cases, to even survive them. For his part, Durkheim wrote of capitalism unleashing what he called an insatiable will that thrust us into an infinite and unregulated pattern of desire that ultimately causes more existential angst or anomie than personal fulfillment. As the modern era matured, though, liberal institutions and liberal sentiments grew ascendant and have largely eclipsed the kinds of concerns expressed by the likes of Marx and Durkheim. Fears about the tendency of city life to kindle unbridled and self-destructive passions have increasingly come to seem hopelessly old-fashioned, quaint, narrow-minded, and prudish. Not only has liberalism largely won the day, but in the Western and particularly in the American context, it has grown so successful in capturing our imaginations that many now take liberalism to be less a theoretical outlook or a moral system devised and promoted by particular people than the universal, eternal, and natural order of things. As the historian Joyce Appleby has noted, what in Europe formed the program for a political party became in the United States a description of reality. Many liberal principles have become so enshrined in our modern institutions and modern sentiments that they are now virtually beyond debate. For example, who among us would wish to take issue with the claims that human nature manifests itself universally in the quest for freedom? Political government emanates from individual self-control. Nature has endowed human beings with the capacity to think for ourselves and act on our own behalf. That rational self-interest can be depended on as a principle of action. That free choice in matters of religion, marriage, intellectual pursuits, and electoral politics is not only a legal or a moral right, but the natural right of every individual. Indeed, I dare say that many of us are quite convinced that we have been endowed by our Creator with the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But in fact, these liberal institutions and sentiments are not universal, natural, or God-given. They do in fact have a history, and they can in fact be shown to be limited in a number of both scientific and ethical respects. To far too briefly review the historical genealogy of those elements of liberal thought most relevant to today's discussion, we can begin by noting a number of inheritances that liberalism has drawn from the Scottish Enlightenment. Taking issue with Thomas Hobbes' egoistic understanding of human nature, one of the founders of the Scottish Enlightenment, Francis Hutcheson, argued that humans are endowed with a moral sense that provides for our learning from and correcting our moral errors. David Hume added that it is through the experience of pain in the face of vice and pleasure in the face of virtue that this moral sense is psychologically experienced. By way of Adam Smith and later utilitarians like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, this naturalized and sentimentalized conception of good and evil was fused with a broader conception of personal preference and transformed into a general conception of human rationality, predicated on the pursuit of happiness. Confluent as it was with socio-historical trends towards religious and ethical pluralism, parliamentary democracy, and free market capitalism, the utilitarian conception of the self as autonomous happiness maximizer has become far and away the most influential of the modern era and remains fundamental to the liberal creed. But by these lights, there can be no distinction between what we desire and what we consider good, because the only measure of goodness is in fact what we desire. My argument today is that this form of liberalism makes distinguishing freedom from the pursuit of what we desire axiomatically impossible, and hence conceptualizing the idea of enslavement to one's desires, that is addiction, equally impossible. By liberal lights, the social environment ceased to be seen as a prospective source of vicious and self-destructive temptations and came instead to be understood as providing only various incentives and disincentives to behave in one way or another. And it was up to each of us individually, as free and hence self-governing and rational actors, to decide what we ourselves regarded as compelling incentives and discouraging disincentives, as long as we did no harm to others. Environmentally induced behavior came to be widely seen then as universally motivated by cost-benefit assessments of the incentives and disincentives attendant to our behavior. Before considering the most current scientific approaches to understanding the influence of environment on addiction, it will be useful to first provide you with some of the evidence suggesting the very considerable significance of such environmental factors. As I've noted, the importance of environmental factors was widely taken for granted throughout the 19th century, but as that century came to a close, more exclusively biological and psychological understandings slowly displaced research that attended to social context. The public debate turned decidedly away from reforming or therapeutically caring for those with addictions and towards prohibition and criminal punishment. Addiction science, to the extent it survived, was engulfed by this more general cultural trend and was largely subordinated to criminal justice agendas. Accordingly, putative addicts were increasingly cast as degenerates, incorrigible psychopaths, or deranged skid row derelicts. In any case, intrinsically defective and beyond hope of therapeutic reform. As the interest in therapeutic reform declined, so too did scientific interest in whether there were environmental causes of either addiction or recovery. One increasingly heard pessimistic pronouncements like once an addict, always an addict. This pessimism was further reinforced by the discouraging statistics that were compiled by various agencies concerned with relapse or recidivism rates after addicts had undergone stints in either correctional facilities or rehabilitation programs, and the evident resistance to rehabilitative efforts that inmates in these facilities could very plainly be seen to exhibit in person. This pessimistic outlook was dealt several significant scientific blows in the second half of the 20th century by research that empirically demonstrated the ubiquity of controlled drug use and outright recovery from addictions that was observed to occur with changes in the life circumstances or the social contexts within which former addicts came to live. In 1962, Charles Winnick published his bombshell demonstration that most of those who engage in patterns of addictive drug use eventually, to use his own words, mature out of these patterns of use naturally as they grow older and more deeply invested in their work, families, and other adult roles. Later, Lee Robbins and her colleagues showed that only very few of those returning Vietnam veterans who had become addicted to heroin in Vietnam resumed their addictions once they came home from the war. Bruce Alexander's Rat Park studies and Norman Zimberg's work on drug set and setting demonstrated that both rodents and humans, respectively, respond and habituate to drug ingestion very differently depending on the social contexts of ingestion. Those with greater resources and a wider range of prospective alternative activities were found far less likely to fall into self-destructive patterns of use. Waldorf, Reinerman, and Murphy noted that their research subjects who possessed what they called a stake in conventional life were both much less likely to fall into self-destructive patterns of drug use, and if in fact they did fall into addiction, were much more likely to pull themselves out. This suggested, as does the bulk of epidemiological research, that it is often social rather than genetic or neurological disadvantages that best predict who is most likely to succumb to addictive drug use and who is least likely to recover from it. In one sense, this research is rather deeply encouraging insofar as it suggests that the problems attendant to addiction can in fact be remedied, rather than being reducible to the overwhelming chemical allure of drugs themselves, relatively fixed biological characteristics like our genes, or relatively fixed psychological characteristics like psychopathy or an addictive personality. This research suggests that by changing people's circumstances, we may very well be able to change their behavior in ways conducive to their own and to society's better flourishing. However, my argument today is that largely due to the dominance exerted by the continuing legacy of liberalism in both addiction science and popular culture, we do not yet have a satisfactory approach to linking behavior with environment that does not either explicitly or implicitly cast that behavior as intrinsically voluntary and rationally adopted. And if addicted behavior is indeed voluntary and rational, then on what grounds shall we argue that acts are in need of and deserving of compassionate and therapeutic interventions as opposed to mere disincentives or punishment? After fleshing out the limitations in this regard exhibited in the contemporary disease and choice literatures on addiction, I will then consider one particularly promising way that the influence of context on addictive behavior can be explained without thereby eviscerating the warrant, that is, the political and cultural warrant for specifically therapeutic interventions. For the most part, disease theorists confine themselves to considerations of laboratory science and give at best peripheral attention to the environmental influences on addiction. To the extent that they do attend to environmental factors, they are overwhelmingly prone to cast these factors in Pavlovian terms, as cues or as secondary reinforcers. According to this logic, drug users cognitively link arbitrary elements of the environments within which drug use takes place with the experience of intoxication. These arbitrary elements of the environment thereby come to cue cravings for drugs, which by virtue of their invariably pleasurable biochemical effects in the brain are understood as the primary reinforcers. This way of modeling environmental factors completely misses the now indisputable fact that the pleasurability of these biochemical effects is not a foregone neurological conclusion, but is itself socially, culturally, and personally variable in the extreme. As the Harvard philosopher Richard Moran has put it, it is sometimes said that certain drugs produce pleasure, but this is true only in the same sense that either string quartets or ripe cheeses produce pleasure. In both cases, we can provide the cause without producing the effect, because the person exposed to either the drug or the music doesn't like it, doesn't see what there is to enjoy in it. What was the very form of hazy, druggy pleasure for someone else is for this person merely some unpleasant dizziness and disorientation. Even here, when we speak of drugs doing this or that, finding pleasure in the experience is a matter of being inclined to take pleasure in what is given. And the fact that such know-how may simply come naturally or spontaneously to the person does not make his engagement any the less active, any more than it does for ordinary physical skills or habits of inference. What is necessary then, and what brain disease theory conspicuously fails to provide, is an understanding of how and why some people do, while other people do not acquire what Moran calls the know-how to take pleasure in various activities that may become addictive. Moreover, by insisting drugs invariably produce pleasure regardless of environmental context, brain disease theory fails to provide for the fact that particular people may enjoy these experiences under some circumstances and wholly detest them under other circumstances. An example I often give with my students is to contrast the experience of being drunk at a party to the experience of being drunk in a final exam. Above and beyond the challenges of providing for the social contextual variability of drug effects neurologically, it must also be noted that current neurological theories of addiction speak only to the hypothesis that heavy drug use increases the propensity of drug users to pursue further drug use. For those of us interested in addiction per se, it is important to note that this hypothesis remains completely silent as to the nature of self-control and the capacities of certain drugs or activities to threaten our self-control. If the loss of self-control is the defining criterion of addiction, as most leaders in the field now readily acknowledge, then it is absolutely indispensable for addiction research to include clear concepts of what the self actually is, such that we find it capable of moving into and out of control of human actions in the first place. It is only then that we will learn how things like addictions might come to attenuate the causal relationship between selves and their actions. To date, neurological theories have remained conspicuously silent on the nature of the self, self-control, or the manner in which drugs might come to undermine them. Finally, because they treat addiction as essentially an extreme form of pleasure-seeking, brain disease theorists also encourage images of the addict as inherently impulsive, hedonistic, short-sighted, undisciplined, self-centered, and incapable of deferring gratification. Images decidedly inconsistent with the therapeutic treatment of addicts as innocent victims of a disease over which they have no control. So quite contrary to the professed intentions of disease theorists to mitigate the moral blaming of addicts and to defend a medicalized or therapeutic approach to the management of addiction, their theories often actually encourage us to blame the victims of addiction for their condition. In his essay, Medical Inquiries and Observations upon the Diseases of the Mind, Benjamin Rush wrote in 1810 of an archetypal account of someone whose addiction had rendered him beyond any capacity to attend rationally to his environment. When strongly urged by one of his friends to leave off drinking, an habitual drunkard said, "Were a keg of rum in one corner of a room and were a cannon constantly discharging balls between me and it, I could not refrain from passing before that cannon in order to get at the rum." Since roughly the 1980s, a growing collection of self-described choice theorists in economics, social psychology, philosophy, and even neuroscience itself has sought to more rigorously develop the position that addiction does not normally resemble anything close to this level of compulsive disregard for one's circumstances. These theorists tend to begin with the observation that most behavior attributed to addictions is incentive sensitive, that is, at least partially consistent with cost-benefit analysis. While they are certainly correct in this respect, we should be careful not to make too much of it. Plants are incentive sensitive in the sense that they grow toward resources like light and water, but we would not normally want to conceptualize this as a voluntary choice. Despite holding that addiction is incentive sensitive, most choice theorists have abandoned the effort to explain addiction by the lights of orthodox rational choice theory. For example, George Ainsley and others have influentially argued that addicts are prone not only to prefer present to future rewards, but to hyperbolically discount the prospects of future costs and benefits. In other words, the greater the expectation of immediate reward and the greater the expected intensity of that reward, the more we become vulnerable to temptations to abandon our longer-term plans and preferences. Hyperbolic discounting, though, is not a form of deliberation confined to addicts. It is a widely shared tendency we all exhibit, whether we're addicts or we're not. Hence, by closing the distance between addiction and generic features of human choice-making, choice theorists tend toward a normalization of addictive reasoning and volition. This makes it difficult to see why or how addiction should warrant suspension of our default practices of holding ourselves and one another morally accountable for our actions in favor of a more therapeutic, sympathetic, and exculpatory stance. Contra choice theory, therapeutic work does not in the first instance require theories that serve only to plausibly explain or to justify addictive behavior. It specifically requires theories that allow these behaviors to be plausibly disowned. It is only by plausibly distinguishing the free agency of addicts from the effects of their addictions that people might be simultaneously understood as amenable to therapeutic empowerment or emancipation from their addictions, and somehow also afflicted by an addiction that justifies and demands such a therapeutic engagement in the first place. Furthermore, those struggling to overcome addictions require theories that go beyond merely providing credible justification for absolution or the disowning of past misdeeds. As all who have sought to care for addicts know, recovery is an ongoing exercise of learning to anticipate and prevent the rekindling of people's addictions, and it requires theories that not only facilitate, but actually warrant such a project in the first place. Choice theorists have made little, if any, headway in this regard. The philosopher Hannah Picard, for example, offers the enticing possibility of holding addicts responsible for overcoming their addictions, but not blaming them for their addictions. But this turns out to be a distinction not between addicts' responsible free agency, which it is the work of therapy to empower, and the agency of their addictions, which might be suppressed and blamed for anticipated relapses. It's a distinction between what she calls detached and affective blame. Detached blame is retained by Picard as both a basis for demanding behavioral change and for negatively sanctioning problematic behavior. We must renounce only affectively infused spite in response to what Picard calls the addict's disorder of choice. Conspicuously missing from her account are first, a warrant for the claim that addicts are emancipated rather than merely domesticated by the changes, quote unquote, therapeutically imposed upon them through negative sanctioning. And second, a warrant for viewing addictive choices as somehow disordered rather than just blameworthy. That is a warrant for therapy over criminal corrections or civil retribution. The criminal justice system certainly blames criminals and is not primarily concerned to therapeutically care for them. But it does nonetheless seek to appear dispassionate in its dispensation of justice, or in Picard's language, to favor detached over affective blame, that is, just deserts over lynch mobs. Similarly, while vigorously and masterfully critiquing brain disease models for mistaking neurological markers of normal learning as markers of pathological brain damage, the celebrated neurologist Mark Lewis repeatedly backslides from his addiction reflects normal rather than pathological learning processes thesis into statements that addictive learning neurologically distorts cognitive functioning. This lapse into usage of the negatively value-laden term distort, with its implications of disfigurement and perversion, is plainly driven by a desire to provide warrant for therapeutic as opposed to coercive interventions. But Lewis offers no explanation for why addiction should be understood as a distortion of normal learning. Indeed, he routinely equates the neurology of negatively valued drug addictions with positively valued preoccupations with things like romantic relationships, sports, and summer holidays. Having denied himself access to the medical mantle of disease, Lewis cannot reconcile his belief that addicts should be cared for and not blamed with his belief that addictions are nonetheless patterns of choice. In sum, addiction science and policy remains to this day torn between the scylla of a biomechanical reductionism that cannot adequately provide for the social contextual variability of the pleasures that people find in drug use, or for the addict's putative loss of control, and the Charybdis of a liberal voluntarism that makes distinguishing self-control from the pursuit of what we desire axiomatically impossible, and hence conceptualizing the idea of enslavement to one's desires, that is addiction, also equally impossible. In both cases, addiction is cast simply as a form of pleasure-seeking. And in both cases, little if any scientific warrant is provided for distinguishing the self-governed pursuit of happiness from the loss of self-control. Because addicts' loss of self-control is so widely presumed to be the sole warrant for a therapeutic rather than a punitive orientation to intervention, in my view, this is a rather profound and serious limitation. As I have said, therapeutic work does not in the first instance require theories that serve only to plausibly explain addictive behavior. It specifically requires theories that allow these behaviors to be disowned. I have argued that neither extant disease theories of addiction nor choice theories have provided such a resource. Both in their own ways conceive of human decision-making as flowing from a singular or unified agent, that is, the addict himself or herself. However, research in neurology, psychology, and sociology is now beginning to more fully appreciate the reality of personal disunity. For example, Mark Lewis has himself written in this regard that habit learning originates piecemeal in setting-specific kinds of ways, but that eventually, because brains tend to conserve structure and resources, habits, or what he calls acquired synaptic networks, often converge and become mutually reinforcing. Crucially, however, he notes that these processes need not converge on a wholly unified subject or a fully integrated hub for all experience, deliberation, and volition. Instead, as he writes, alternative synaptic networks can compete with each other. This is the case when addiction arises in development, but also when it dissipates, replaced by the desire for and belief in alternative outcomes. What Lewis fails to fully appreciate, however, and what prevents him from reconciling his incisive understanding of the neurology of addiction with his hope to produce a warrant for therapeutic care, is the labial and dynamic relationships that occur between the diverse habits he describes as the neuroplastic synaptic networks that comprise our biomechanical brains on the one hand, and on the other hand, ourselves, specifically as self-discovering, self-actualizing, self-governing, and morally accountable subjects. Lewis, like most addiction scientists, argues that addiction is a constellation of habits that grows from the repeated pursuit of something highly desired. But his distinctive emphasis on neuroplasticity and the disunity of our synaptic networks opens up an unprecedented path. While he acknowledges a deep intellectual debt to the neurologist Kent Berridge, who has argued that some substances and or experiences are naturally or intrinsically desirable given the neurological hardwiring of our brains, Lewis never himself explicitly adopts this view and is, as noted, much more likely to highlight neuroplasticity and neurodiversity than hardwired universal dispositions to take pleasure in things. Unlike most neurologists, then, his work is consistent with the fact that not all people enjoy drug-induced experiences. It is also consistent with the fact that particular people may enjoy these experiences under some circumstances and hate them under other circumstances. Lewis's neurological insights in this regard strongly support a view of the body as host to diverse and perhaps conflicting desiring subjectivities. However, though he notes that our habits emerge, develop, and are sustained with respect to specific settings, he has not pursued this line of inquiry in any significant depth. For those curious, by the way, Lewis has published a synopsis of his theory of addiction in the October 2018 issue of the New England Journal of Medicine, and I'd recommend you look at it. It's a great article. We may, however, look to the eminent French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu for a much more fully articulated approach to the relationship between habit and environmental, or what I'm calling ecological, settings. Bourdieu argued that most of our behavior is not adjusted to our environments consciously or deliberatively, but is instead adjusted habitually. By participating in and experiencing these environments, we acquire what he called a habitus, an implicit and unreflective feel for the game, or a practical sense of what is required to cope in these environments. Likewise, our embodied experience of the various elements that make up these environments are also understood ecologically, with respect to the practical activities within which these elements emerge as meaningful and practically relevant to us. Bourdieu thereby synthesizes the objective and the subjective dimensions of experience into a sophisticated phenomenology capable of being applied across the spectrum of human encounters with the world, from basketball to genetic laboratories. To be clear, Bourdieu's approach is self-consciously opposed to the notion that our bodies are somehow in direct and unmediated contact with the objective world through brute sensation, or what philosophers have sometimes called raw feels. Instead, along with most other contemporary epistemologists and phenomenologists, Bourdieu offers a litany of arguments that decisively refute the notion that human perception can be divided into the body's passive apprehension of unmediated brute sensations and the mind's active symbolic interpretation of their meaning. If we heed these arguments and accept that meaningful experience often takes place at a pre-reflective and habitual level of being, we may begin to flesh out, pardon the pun, a highly promising approach to studying addiction. This approach allows us to much more effectively theorize the sociogenic or environmental influences on drug use, drug experiences, and addiction. It does so by allowing us to avoid the mistakes of treating them either as Pavlovian side effects of generic neurological processes or as self-governed and rational cost-benefit analyses. By the lights of an ecological approach to meaning and social learning, the meanings and practical relevancies that attach to the effects of drug ingestion, including the pleasure or displeasure they are perceived to produce, should not be understood as acquired through processes of learning to interpret the brute biochemical effects of drugs in our brains, but through processes of learning to use drugs as resources in given fields of practical action. It is not necessary that individuals consciously interpret drug effects in order to develop subtle competencies regarding the perception and operationalization of those effects in practical action. It is only necessary that agents become convinced that there are uses to which they can put given drugs and come to incorporate drug use into the conduct of their lives. For example, individuals may find themselves viscerally drawn to the use of alcohol in order to relax after a long day at work, or to stimulate their playful participation in the goings-on of a party, if indeed they have found the use of alcohol conducive to the accomplishment of such projects in the past. The visceral experiences that follow from, as well as those which incline one toward the use of a drug, can thus be understood as deriving in some significant part from the historically and culturally specific contexts in which and for which one has learned to use the drug. Obviously, if use of the drug has not been experienced as conducive to meeting the demands of a given practical environment, it will be unlikely to inspire future visceral inclinations towards its use in similar environments. Hence the ubiquity of maturing out of drug habits as people grow into more stable and demanding adult roles. Drug problems arise when individuals or their significant others perceive that their reliance on a drug for coping in one area of their lives has a negative impact on their coping in that or in other areas. According to this approach, this perception is often not enough to produce cessation of drug use because the inclination to use does not manifest in experience as a deliberate decision, let alone a holistic cost-benefit analysis, but rather a visceral urge informed by the perceived practical demands of the moment. However, the difficulties thus experienced may occur with various degrees of intensity, depending on whether individuals are competent or are confident they can become competent in exercising coping techniques other than drug use, or are relatively free to avoid the settings of practical action in which drugs had become integral to their perceived ability to cope. In an analysis of scientific practice that strikes me as analogous to the analysis of drug use that I'm offering here, the sociologist of science Andrew Pickering described how physicists adopted a particular technological device for the conduct of experimentation. Pickering suggests that physicists would not have adopted the device if they had not experienced it as at least potentially conducive to accomplishing the practical projects for which it was engaged. He notes, however, that this claim does not require him to adopt a realist or essentialist understanding of physical science nor the physical world. The same point goes for my analysis of drug use. To claim that people would not likely feel compelled to use a drug if they had not experienced its use as conducive to the accomplishment of particular practical projects does not demand an essentialist or realist view of the biochemical effects of drugs on human consciousness, or on the brain for that matter. The efficacy of experimental technologies and of drugs is experienced by way of and with respect to the experiencer's historically and culturally emergent practical activities, and not the determinate physical or neurological structures of the physical or psychopharmacological essentialist. However, this analytic tact by no means entails rejecting the relevance of biochemical, psychopharmacological, or neurological insights to our understanding of drug-induced experience and addictive drug use. It only calls for a rejection of the proposition that the biochemical changes that occur when certain drugs are introduced into human bodies are themselves the sole producers of specific kinds of experiences, no matter what the ecological context of drug administration happens to be. Okay, a caveat is now in order. Because he was primarily concerned to explain how people are often unwittingly complicit in preventing their own social mobility, Bourdieu tended to write of a more or less unified habitus, adjusted to the general positions we are normally compelled to occupy in the social world. This said, very good reasons can be found both in Bourdieu's own work and elsewhere to suggest the possibility of a more divided or pluralized habitus. For example, Bourdieu's protege, Loïc Vacant, writes in an article published in 2016, habitus is not necessarily coherent and unified. Rather, it displays varying degrees of integration and tension, depending on the character and compatibility of the social situations that fashioned it over time. A sequence of congruent institutions and stable microcosms will tend to fashion a cohesive habitus, whose successive layers reinforce one another and work in unison. Dissimilar organizations, anchored by divergent values or entropic universes by contrast, cultivate unstable systems of dispositions divided against themselves and want to generate irregular and inconsistent lines of action. Vacant's invocation of unstable systems of dispositions divided against themselves and want to generate irregular and inconsistent lines of action will no doubt ring a bell for students of addiction. The fact that these dispositions are understood as acquired but pre-conscious or habitual is also deeply resonant with what we know empirically about addictions. What may be less well established is the premise that these unstable dispositions are products of clashes pressed upon us by the contexts of our lives, rather than clashes between short-term and long-term preferences. Pertaining to the warrant and facilitation of therapeutic care for addicts, this approach valuably augments what is now a virtually unrivaled understanding of the instability of addicts' dispositions to act in terms of a temporal contrast between short-term and long-term preferences. Despite their earnest hopes to encourage compassion and therapeutic care, the steadfast and almost myopic focus of addiction scientists on temporal mechanisms of preference instability, like hyperbolic discounting, inevitably results in images of addicts as impulsive, hedonistic, and incapable of deferring gratification. Weighed down by images like these, it is very difficult to counter the ubiquitous tendency both among healthcare professionals and the wider public to blame addicts for their fates. While we are all prone to greater and lesser degrees of personal integration, depending on the extent to which we have been shaped by what Kant calls dissimilar organizations anchored by divergent values or entropic universes, I would argue the failure of personal integration can sometimes become so extreme as to precipitate a radical personal and moral divestment from fragments of our habitus that effectively divorces those fragments from our own or our significant others' sense of who we really are. That is, more specifically, our addictions from our free agency as self-discovering, self-actualizing, and self-governing moral subjects. Incidentally, by showing how many different patterns of drug use can conceivably come to be experienced by drug users as alien to them and as beyond their control, an ecological approach to the meaning and social learning attendant to drug use and drug-induced experience also avoids what Robin Room has called the problem of entitativity faced by disease theories of addiction. Unlike orthodox disease theories, the ecological rubric I've outlined here does not demand that we account for the vast range of patterns in which drug problems actually occur as consequences of a single disease entity, like alcoholism. Seen in this light, the status of addiction as a form of disease need not be decided with rigid reference to whether suffering can be decisively linked to isolated dysfunctional biological mechanisms, but more generally, with reference to any number of different patterns of seemingly harmful, alienating, and intransigent constellations of ecologically grounded habit, with which we cannot or do not want to identify ourselves, precisely because they are seen as harmful or dangerous to those habits with which we do self-identify. This understanding of the environmental influences on addiction also illuminates better than does received addiction science why and how interventions like 12-step groups and therapeutic communities have been so comparatively attractive to those seeking help with their addictions and to those predisposed to provide such help. In contrast to other forms of therapeutic care, these kinds of interventions seek to emphasize the provision of immersive ecological alternatives to the spaces within which people's addictions were forged and within which they might continue to be kindled and rekindled. They are, in other words, comparatively better keyed to the linkage of our habits to the various ecological spaces within which they are acquired and sustained, and within which we also evaluate their compatibility with our specific projects of self-discovery and ongoing self-actualization. Rather than focus, as most addiction science has, on therapeutic techniques for fostering people's commitment to longer-term over shorter-term cost-benefit calculations, ecologically grounded interventions direct considerably more attention to the details of the worlds within which our particular efforts to self-actualize, in both the shorter and in the longer term, are most and least likely to be stabilized and to thrive. Thank you.
Questions for Dr. Weinberg?
Physiological withdrawal?
Yeah, so pleasure is highly contextual, and withdrawal is just a painful experience, do you think? And it is so prevalent in, let's say, very serious, like once heroin addiction has progressed, or alcohol addiction, and withdrawal is been driving over sustaining the addiction more even than pleasure seeking. So do you think it's the pain of withdrawal as contextual as the...
Well, actually, contemporary addiction science is no longer quite as invested in the role that withdrawal symptoms play. And the major event that catalyzed this sort of distancing from that kind of theory was the advent of crack cocaine.
I can't hear.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll just speak. The advent of crack cocaine, because people discovered that actually people got quite self-destructively invested in crack cocaine use, but crack doesn't produce the kinds of withdrawal symptoms that alcohol does or that heroin does. And so most people are now saying that while withdrawal can frighten people under certain circumstances, given certain kinds of drug use, from undertaking recovery, it's not the long-term problem. Another aspect to this is that we now have various kinds of pharmacological interventions that can ease the transition, that can get people through what was once called cold turkey in a fairly painless kind of way. And so the problem is not so much the withdrawal symptoms, it's the propensity to slip after one's emerged from those withdrawal symptoms. And so withdrawal no longer has quite the explanatory punch that it once did.
Could you expand a little on your concept of failure of personal integration?
Yeah.
It sounds kind of like a modernist unified self, but it seems like you're arguing against that.
I am arguing against
Yeah.
that. Okay, what I would argue is that both the neurologists, by and large, with a few exceptions, like, for example, Mark Lewis, and the choice theorists, tend to regard humans as unified, as individuals, though that being that can't be divided. My argument is that this has a lot to do with this legacy of liberal theory, that we are seen to be self-governing in a holistic kind of way, weighing up the cost of benefits of various courses of action. This notion of personal disintegration is not a new one. I mean, I think that psychoanalysis took this idea seriously for a long time. Now psychoanalysis itself is not taken so seriously. And so that kind of thinking has been submerged in the sort of contemporary scientific debates, but I wanted to bring it back. I think that it's important to realize that our various talents for proceeding with our lives emerge in setting specific kinds of ways. And that by and large, we're all just getting on with our life in these various kinds of contexts. And we are all, to that extent, not that integrated. But by and large, it's not a big deal. I mean, I used the example earlier today of, for me to have a variety of, my body to be host to a variety of desiring subjects may or may not be a problem. For example, if I love and have a great deal of affection for my partner, but also love and have a great deal of affection for music, those things don't necessarily need to be integrated that much. But if I love and have a great deal of affection for my partner and also her best friend, now we've got a problem. You see what I'm saying? And so the question is not the degree of integration or lack of integration, it's the extent to which there's a clash between those various kinds of desiring subjectivities. And my argument is that addiction is a term that we use to describe a clash, wherein one element of who we are is at odds with elements that we take more seriously, that we more heavily identify with. And we divorce ourselves from those elements of our being. And I also think, this is not something I raised in the paper, but I also think this helps us understand the ongoing ambivalence that people often have with respect to recovery. It's very commonly the case that people will relapse because they think, you know what? I'm not sure there's that level of clash that I used to think, I used to think that maybe my alcohol use was interfering too much with my work, but now, in retrospect, I think I'm okay. I mean, to give you a personal example, my brother has been clean for 10 years now, but his kids are getting older, and he's now playing with the idea, very abstractly, very theoretically, of once they move out of the house, once that's sorted and he's finished off with his parental responsibilities, his need to be a good role model for them on a day in, day out basis is gone. Maybe he might consider the idea of sitting out on his garden looking over the water and having a drink from time to time. But maybe he's past the period in his life when he needed to so dramatically change his lifestyle as to get himself out of those self-destructive patterns. I'm not my brother's keeper. I'm not going to tell him what to do, but I think, a lot of people in the recovery industry say that might be true. Maybe you're going to be able to do that, but do you really want to take that chance? Yeah.
Can I ask you a more practical question?
Sure.
So if you ruled the world and you were trying to do something about the opioid crisis that we have, what would be your ecologically grounded therapeutic technique?
Well, the first point,
if you were running programs,
you
had all the money that you needed.
Well, the first thing that I would point out is that the crisis, the epidemic, tends to be cast in terms of OD fatalities rather than addiction itself. So I would first want to clarify that issue, because I think a lot of people that are dying may or may not have developed addictions. And I'm talking about addictions. I'm not talking about accidental overdoses. And I think that a lot of the people that accidentally overdose are not drug addicts. In fact, maybe quite the reverse. They're naive about the power that these drugs can have and the dangers of using them. But with respect to addiction, I think what I would say is I would invest in these kinds of programs that are looking at immersive ecological alternatives to the spaces in which drug use became integral to people's perceived capacity to
Can you
cope
be
with
more
their life.
specific?
Yeah, can you give an example? Because that's the same question I had. So
Okay.
how does this look, this ecologically grounded therapeutic techniques that we might use? in
Okay,
this case?
well, I mean, just to draw from AA, I mean, they're trying to give you an alternative community. They're trying to give you a bunch of techniques for thinking about where to go and what to do with your lives. I mean, to use jargon that they use, the avoidance of triggers in your life. I mean, who are the people that set you off? What are the circumstances in your life that set you off? Can you rearrange your life to avoid those triggers? Or another expression they use is slippery places. Can you
But
avoid?
isn't it the case that AA, once an alcoholic, always an alcoholic?
Yeah, I would say the AA, some of the other mantras, don't seem to fit with this as well.
Okay, well, what I would argue is that the once an alcoholic, always an alcoholic slogan in AA is a very, very different slogan than the once an addict, always an addict. That was a write-off mentality. I mean, when people said once an addict, always an addict, that was an excuse for not investing in the recovery of people, whereas AA is not saying that. AA, by saying once an alcoholic, always an alcoholic, is no matter how long you've been clean, you still need to be vigilant. And so I would say it's a far less pessimistic orientation. And I think that's right. I think that, to put it in the terms that I've been promoting today, to say that I am now able to live my life in a way that's not as vulnerable as it once was to these self-destructive patterns of use is not to say those habits have been completely extinguished. And I think the neurology here speaks to this. These synaptic networks, to use Lewis's language, don't just vanish overnight. And so I would argue that because they're still there, even if dormant, that the kind of vigilance that AA encourages is probably well placed. I fear that I might not have been sufficiently specific with respect to the kinds of techniques that I'm suggesting, but let me defend that on this basis. I think different people's addictions are different, and that different people develop different ways in which they are self-destructive with respect to their drug use. And so I'd be reluctant to say there's a one-size-fits-all. I'd just say, if I were a clinician or a recovery specialist, I'd be saying, let's talk about your triggers and your slippery places, your triggers and slippery places, not somebody else's. And let's talk about the extent to which you can avoid those things. And I also want to emphasize that it's often the case that people can't avoid things. Like, for example, if I've got a job that I need to keep because I need to support a family and stuff, I can be fairly locked in. So the point here is to retool with respect to the ecological space within which your addiction has been sort of forged and within which it gets kindled and rekindled. And so it's not always the case. I'm not meaning to suggest that this is a panacea or a magic bullet. It's not always the case that people can just extricate themselves from the circumstances in which their addictions are forged and inflamed. And so if that's the case, then maybe we need to think about developing other kinds of tools. But if it is the case, let's do it. I mean, I think that the easier approach is the approach that says, why subject yourself to those stressors? Why subject yourself to those triggers if you don't have to? But to realize, I think, that these habits are not habits that are acontextual. These are habits that develop under particular kinds of circumstances. That's the fundamental thrust of my thesis today, is that we need to remember that habits are forged under circumstances. It's not just a function of how our brains work or whether we have an addictive personality or not. It's also, and importantly, a function of the kinds of spaces within which we're compelled to live. Yeah.
I don't know if you could expand a little bit on that. That was part of your paper that the class had read, where you talked about the different ecological settings and how there was a clear understanding of that's not accepted behavior there, and there was some trust there in the out there versus I know that's not accepted care, we don't relate to each other that way. And I think that was very clarifying so, maybe that we can expand on a little bit, because that was clarifying for us when we read that.
Okay, when I wrote that paper, I was making a distinction between the science, the kinds of narratives that are used to do good science, and the kinds of narratives that need to be used to conduct effective clinical interventions. And I think that I distinguished between those things quite starkly. Now, several years later, I'm beginning to think that I let science off the hook too much. I mean, to say that all we need to do as scientists is explain why it is these people have these self-destructive investments totally divorces science from its, number one, clinical relevance, and number two, its broader cultural and political relevance. And so what I'm trying to say in this paper is, I think historically, science has not just been concerned with doing good science, getting at the empirical truth of the matter. I think if that's all we're trying to do, then talking about incentive sensitivity is a pretty good way of talking. I think it's right to say that by and large, people can be dissuaded from using it. The problem with that is, as I've said, it completely rationalizes and voluntarizes this problem. And I think that we lose our warrant. We lose our justification for engaging therapeutically rather than punitively under these circumstances. And I think that because science has for such a long time been kind of, I don't want to say indispensable, but very, very significantly involved in the public policy discourses regarding the justification of therapeutic as opposed to punitive intervention, that I'm now more compelled than I was then to demand of the science that it think a little bit more about providing a warrant for care. Yeah.
You're talking to some psychology students who are here. How are you distinguishing therapeutic versus clinical?
I'm not.
Oh, okay.
Well, what I would say is, let me be slightly more careful. I don't think that clinicians have a monopoly on therapeutic interventions. I think family members and other people can too. So I wouldn't want to confine the work of therapy to the clinic. But that's a fairly hair-splitting precious distinction. Yeah.
So related to this issue of perhaps what kind of practical recommendations would you see following from your arguments for treatment? On the previous slide, you said something about having the viewpoint that addiction is some kind of moral divestment from fragments of our practice.
Right.
I just wanted to say a little bit more about that.
Well, as I say, I'm thinking now that we need to think, and once again, under certain circumstances. The vast majority of us are not addicts, and so the degree of integration or disintegration that we live with in our lives doesn't appear on the clinical radar, as it were. But I would say that under circumstances that Kant describes as very disjunctive, that the likelihood that we're going to begin to see certain elements of our habitual orientation to orient our life as jarring or inconsistent with who we take ourselves to be increases.
So would that, say, be related to people who lose their jobs and they're facing chronic unemployment and losing their houses? Would that be an example of, say,
I think that would be an example of a circumstance in which our habitus begins to fragment. But whether or not that precipitates the kind of moral divestment that I'm talking about is another question.
You also have the sense of, I don't think I've heard in your arguments, reference to, I guess you would call them the deviance theorists of sociology, right? So that kind of category of people who have a embark on a moral career of something like addiction or other sort of deviant behavior because it's got certain kinds of rewards and offers a lifestyle of its own. Is that sort of all part of the background of what you're
In a sense. I mean, I've written about that literature, and I've complained about that literature because I think that they tend to collapse questions of morally disapproved drug use with questions of whether it's voluntary or involuntary. And I think a lot of the literature, being liberal and progressive, was saying, mainstream culture or elite culture tends to disparage these people, and if you go out and study them ethnographically, they don't do that to themselves. There's a sense of local legitimacy, but there's, a local subcultural value system that they're adhering to, and they don't pathologize themselves. And what I would say is that's true. I think the vast majority of people that use drugs, even a lot, even self-destructively, don't pathologize themselves. But I'm saying, yeah, but what about these people that do dread their drug habit? You know? I would say, yes, let's all acknowledge that the vast majority of people that use drugs and alcohol don't develop problems. That needs to be acknowledged. And I said today that, you know, that truth, that fact is going to be an important fact for us to marshal in the efforts to decriminalize and get this war on drugs things, you know, minimized to the extent we can. So it's a crucial argument. But what I would say is it begs the question of addiction. And I personally don't think we should conflate, as the deviance literature I think too often did, morally disapproved behavior with involuntary behavior. And so I'm trying to think about, okay, for those people that really do dread their drug habits, how are we going to talk about that? How are we going to combine a sensitivity to the fact that social context matters with a sensitivity to the fact that these people feel really, really alone and really afraid of their addictive patterns of behavior. They don't feel it as a cost-benefit analysis. Well, you know, love my family a lot, love the drugs more. It's an unfortunate expense of my drug habit. That's not how they look at it. They look at it like, why can't I stop this? Who am I? What's going on? So that's what I would say about deviance literature.
I think on that note, I'd like to back on to Weinberg. Thank you everybody for coming along. We will be in on the 19th of March for our next lecture in good?
March. I think it's the 5th.
Good.
I just don't
March
have it in
5th?
front of me.
Where are you? Right here.
And we're in this room. Yes.
That's right here. Bye.
Thanks again.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. It was nice to meet you.